The rain was falling hard that evening, the kind of storm that makes the whole city stop for a moment. Expensive cars splashed through puddles, and people rushed under shelters holding umbrellas worth more than a laborer's monthly wage. Inside a mansion at the top of the hill lived Edward Raymond, a self-made millionaire in his early 40s. His glass walls reflected the lightning flashing outside, cold, powerful, and distant, just like him. Edward had everything: wealth, cars, power, and a mansion so huge it echoed when he spoke. But what he didn't have was peace. He had built his empire with discipline and toughness, and had little patience for weakness. That evening, Edward was working late in his study when he noticed something unusual through the rain-streaked window. Outside, near the servant quarters, someone was sitting alone, under the pouring rain. He squinted. It was Maria, his maid. She was sitting on a small wooden stool, her uniform soaked completely through, holding a steel lunchbox in her lap. At first, Edward felt irritated. "What kind of nonsense is this?" he muttered. "Eating in the rain? Can't she do that inside?" He watched her lift a spoonful of rice to her mouth, then pause, and offer the next bite to a tiny stray dog sitting beside her, trembling from the cold. Edward frowned, leaning closer to the glass. Maria smiled faintly at the animal, even though her own food was meager, just plain rice and a few slices of onion. She tore a piece of her bread and placed it in front of the dog, whispering something Edward couldn't hear. For a moment, Edward felt something strange, a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years, but he quickly brushed it off. "She's being foolish," he said to himself. Probably didn't want to dirty the kitchen. Still, something about the sight stuck with him. The next morning, Edward called Maria to his office. She entered quietly, her head bowed. "Maria," he said sternly, "I saw you last night, eating outside in the rain." "Why?" Maria froze. She looked terrified. "Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "I'm not asking for apologies," he interrupted. "Just tell me why." She hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "Sir, I didn't want to dirty the kitchen floor. You had guests yesterday, and I thought—" Edward leaned back, studying her face. "And the dog?" Maria's eyes softened. "He comes every night when it rains, sir. He doesn't have anyone. I can't watch him starve." There was silence. The sound of the rain outside filled the room again. Edward cleared his throat. "You care too much," he said coldly. "That's not how the world works." But as Maria turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something, her hands trembling slightly, her shoes completely worn out, and a faint bruise on her wrist. Something wasn't right. For the rest of the day, Edward couldn't focus on his work. The image of Maria feeding the stray dog kept returning to his mind, like a whisper he couldn't ignore. That night, when everyone was asleep, he walked out quietly toward the servant quarters. He wanted to understand. Through the half-open door, he saw Maria again, sitting on the floor, mending a small pair of shoes. Children's shoes, and beside her was a photograph of a little boy. Edward waited until morning. When Maria came in to clean, he stopped her again. "Maria," he said softly this time. "Whose child is that?" Her eyes widened. "Sir, you saw." He nodded. "Tell me." Tears filled her eyes as she took a shaky breath. "He's my son, Daniel. He's 6. Where is he now?" Edward asked. Maria looked down. "In the hospital. He's been sick for months. I can't afford his treatment, so I work double shifts. I send everything I earn to the hospital. I only eat what's left, sometimes once a day. That's why—" She paused, voice breaking. "That's why I eat outside. I don't want anyone to see me cry." Edward felt his throat tighten. The woman who quietly kept his mansion spotless, who never complained, who smiled while serving others, was living a life of silent pain. He asked softly, "Why didn't you ask for help?" Maria shook her head. "You've already done so much by giving me this job, sir. I didn't want to trouble you." For a long moment, Edward said nothing. Then he stood up and walked toward the window. The rain had begun again. "Which hospital?" he finally asked. Maria looked at him, confused. "St. Mary's, sir." Within an hour, Edward's car pulled up outside St. Mary's Hospital. He didn't tell Maria he was coming. He just went. When he entered the children's ward, the nurses looked surprised to see a man in an expensive suit. He found the small bed with a fragile little boy sleeping under thin blankets, Maria's son. The child was pale, weak, but peaceful. On the bedside table was a drawing, a stick figure of a woman holding hands with a man in a suit and a small boy. Written above it in shaky letters, "Mommy's boss helps us someday." Edward stood frozen. That single piece of paper hit him harder than any business failure ever had. He called the doctor immediately and asked for the boy's treatment plan. The costs were overwhelming, far beyond Maria's means. Without hesitation, Edward said quietly, "Send all the bills to me." Later that evening, when Maria returned to the hospital after work, she found her son smiling, a nurse telling her the treatment had been paid in full. She ran out of the ward, tears streaming down her face, and found Edward standing near the exit, hands in his pockets, watching the rain. "Sir," she cried, Why would you do this?" Edward looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Because sometimes the richest people are not the ones with money. They're the ones who keep giving even when they have nothing." Maria broke down in tears. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you," Edward nodded. "No, Maria. Thank you for reminding me what humanity looks like." From that day on, things changed. Maria's son recovered slowly, and Edward visited often. He arranged for Maria's family to live in a small home near the mansion, so she could stay close to her son. And as for the stray dog, it became the mansion's new guardian, living under Edward's care. Sometimes on rainy nights, Edward would sit by the window and watch Maria's son play in the garden with the dog. And he would remember that night, when a simple act of kindness from a maid broke open the walls around a millionaire's heart. Because sometimes, the smallest act of love can heal the biggest wounds. Never judge someone by where they stand, because sometimes, those with the least to give the most from their hearts. A single act of kindness can change not just one life, but two. If this story touched you, share it. Let's remind the world humanity still exists.